There's a subtle but very real difference outside of the sheer numbers of atheists in Europe and their less confident American atheist counterpart.
You know, Brock, speaking of a complex social reality in such an homogeneous fashion is the product of a lazy and ignorant mind. One simply cannot speak of European atheism in the way that you do. Now, I'm going to try and impose some intelligence onto your rhetoric by assuming that when you do speak of European atheists, you are in fact referring to those members of populations whose nations have become rather secular in nature.
You can see this distinction very clearly among the YouTube atheist community.
Well, that's kind of funny, Brock, because in my experience, and please note that qualification I just offered of in my experience, because unlike yourself, I have the integrity to admit that my experience of such things is necessarily limited. You might want to take a leaf out of that particular book, but in my experience, YouTube atheism has a rather international flavour, whereas YouTube Christianity tends to smell of hot dogs and apple pie. Or maybe I should say, grits and moonshine, yee-haw!
By and large, the American godless seem to have this very strong emotional reaction to Judeo-Christianity. The American atheist is much more likely to get those tail feathers flustered when confronted with Christian values. It's an attitude the European anti-theist doesn't have anymore, although, of course, they once did.
Well, aside from the fact that the term Christian values is one utterly devoid of meaning, it's not Christian values that American atheists get flustered about, Brock. It's Christian stupidity, Christian lies, Christian tyranny. The fact is that American atheists, unlike their counterparts in many secularized European nations, are still surrounded by morons. They're still surrounded by ignorance and religious fanaticism that reaches all the way up social hierarchies, right up to the very top, where you can have a president who will happily declare that atheists ought not even be considered citizens of their own nation. Many European atheists in heavily secularized nations are not subject to these sorts of pressures. They don't have the outstanding issues that American atheists have. They don't have, for example, idiot Christians attempting to push for pseudoscience to be taught alongside genuine science. American atheists yet have every reason to be flustered and discontented.
A large portion of the American godless were once Jews, they were once Christians. And for that reason, I think they're made very uncomfortable by visible signs of devotion and faith. It seems almost like they have a bad conscience about their rejection of traditional values.
Actually, the difference is that Europeans have a powerful and complex philosophical history that they can turn to in the face of religious delusion and ignorance. I'm afraid Americans simply do not have that same history to turn to. Indeed, straw-chewing yokels like yourself have an obvious case of cultural cringe when it comes to Europe for that very reason. You suffer from a kind of envy over that history. What American atheists have, Brock, is a weak stomach for the Christian delusion and ignorance and arrogance that they are forced to contend with on a daily basis. What you see in their faces, Brock, is not the pangs of conscience, but simple dyspepsia.
Almost as if they know deep down that something vital and true springs from the Judeo-Christian message.
Oh, they know full well that something vital and true springs from the Christian Judeo tradition. What they know from that is the depth of the capacity of human beings for delusion and egotistical folly. So yes, you do indeed perceive a deep form of knowing in the faces of the atheists around you, Brock. But sadly, like everything else, you're just incapable of interpreting it correctly.
Almost as if the truth of that message still moves them.
Oh, but it does still move them, Brock.
Although they say and think they've modernized, they can't seem to marry this modernization with the traditional longings of common sense and wisdom that still stir in their soul.
It's very difficult to live by what your intellect and your ethical impulses are telling you when you are in the midst of an environment whose very nature opposes all of the content of that intellect and ethical impulses. It's also difficult when your every thought and action is characterized by rampant egotists such as yourself as actually expressive of that rampantly egotistical nature.
Some might be bold enough to call this the last flickering ember of God's voice in their spirit.
And yet others might call it the lingering odor of the superstitious dog shit they've been trying to scrape off their shoes.
I've learned the hard way that these atheists hate anyone with a passion who attempts to fan the flame of that tension and tug-of-war within them that they try desperately to kill, but just can't seem to do it quite right.
Good God, Brock, is there any limit to your vanity? What atheists hate is the dishonesty and that very vanity that underpins all those efforts.
My belief that they're like this because along the way they were given the shards and the pieces of wisdom and truth somewhere. Perhaps it was a soft-spoken grandmother. Perhaps it was a quick brush with vacation Bible school. Perhaps it was the undismissible, tangible demonstration of Christ's love by a stranger. However, when a person's been confronted with the truth of the gospel and then mindfully chooses to turn his will and his life against the commandments of God, that person gets very angry when reminders of that choice veer their head.
Man, you are such a windbag. You really ought to get a job at a carnival blowing up children's balloons. Atheists do not become angry when confronted with the supposed choice that they've made. What angers them, indeed if anything angers them at all, is the stupidity with which that proposition is put to them. It's the banality and arrogance and self-righteousness that composes the very notion that the truth of the Gospels has ever been demonstrated. God knows, Brock, you've never done that. In fact, I don't believe that you've spent as much as 30 seconds even attempting to do so.
And then there are the European atheists who are much more self-assured. Here we find the aged grapes in the wine of godlessness, you might say.
European atheists are not more self-assured. They are simply more comfortable. They are more comfortable because they have less of the bullshit that American atheists have to deal with. That's the real difference, Brock. In those European countries where secularism has not taken hold to the degree that it has in places like the Scandinavian nations or France or Germany, etc., the situation for those atheists is pretty much the same as what is faced by American atheists on a daily basis. There will come a time, inshallah, that American atheists will possess the degree of comfort of their European kin.